Welcome to the Measuring World Language Proficiency webinar with a focus on formative assessment. Today's broadcast on Wednesday, May 8th will be 1 hour long. The Measuring World Language Proficiency series looks at using different assessment measures and data in the classroom to evaluate language proficiency, including this one on formative assessment. All K-20 World Language administrators, teachers, and instructors are welcome at these broadcasts and are welcome to share this information with others. Here's today's agenda. We will begin with a welcome and overview of formative assessment and specifically formative assessment in world languages. We'll also have a focus on LinguaFolio and can-do learning as part of our thinking about formative assessment, including standards-aligned resources and classroom materials that are available for free as part of LinguaFolio, and then a small discussion of the introduction to LinguaFolio Canvas course that is available, and other resources for implementation of LinguaFolio in your classroom. We'll finish by talking about any questions we have, as well as some reminders and resources for you to take away from today and use as part of your work and professional development. Let's start with an overview of formative assessment. Some of you may recognize the Comprehensive Balanced Assessment System graphic that you see on the right-hand bottom of the screen. This was something that the Department of Public Instruction, North Carolina, compiled some years ago as part of their accountability measures, as well as a vision for 21st century assessment. You can see that the foundation of a comprehensive balanced assessment system is, in fact, classroom assessments, both formative and summative. We're going to focus today on formative. One of our broadcasts prior to this was on summative assessment, and you can always go back and check that information if you would like it. But for formative assessment, we want to talk about what that is. The definition given on the website you see there, which also has the graphic, simply states that formative assessment is a process used by teachers and students during instruction that provides feedback to adjust ongoing teaching and learning to help students improve their achievement of intended instructional outcomes. So notice that this is a slightly different type of assessment than we sometimes think about when we hear the words assessment or even accountability. This has to do with a process. So we're not taking a grade here on this. We're simply using something within the classroom during our teaching time to inform our instruction and make sure that we're helping students learn in the best way possible. There are lots of types of formative assessment, and I'm sure you've used many of them, probably today if you were in the classroom. Some formative assessment might be just questioning and the way you use questions in your classroom to engage students' thinking. Discussions are also part of formative assessment because you get to hear what students are thinking and you get to share with them in their process of constructing meaning in your classroom. Learning activities of all kinds are what we do during instruction, and that is formative assessment. And again, formative assessment in that sense, particularly with learning activities, is used to gauge what students know and are able to do, but not for the purpose of a grade, for the purpose of checking where they are and then adding on to what they know and adjusting your own instruction as a teacher. We also give feedback as part of formative assessment, particularly with checks for understanding or strategies of formative assessment that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. That feedback is always critical to help students understand where they are and how they can improve on what they're doing in your classroom. And that's very easy to gauge with a check for understanding, which can be simple and quick. Also, conferences are a type of formative assessment, whether it's a parent-teacher conference or a student-teacher conference, or even a peer-to-peer conference. And so the kinds of things you discuss in conferences and share with each other help inform your instruction and the learning that goes on in your classroom. Interviews are another type of formative assessment when you might interview someone to find out what they know or to have them share with you what they can do with the language. And then, of course, we have student reflections, whether that's just a simple reflection or a self-assessment of some kind. It's just a way for students to think about the learning process that they're using and how that's working for them and what could be done to improve that. So there's lots of types of formative assessment that we use. Now, formative assessment is found at the classroom level, as you see from the graphic, of course, and happens minute to minute or in very short cycles. Formative assessment is not graded or used in accountability systems. The feedback involved in formative assessment is descriptive in nature, so that students know what they need to do next to improve learning. This also, of course, informs what the teacher needs to do next. One thing I should mention is that all of this information, these slides, some of the things I'm sharing with you, the links and so forth, are always available in the notes section of these slides, so you can get those if you need them later. So let's talk about formative assessment in world languages. I'm going to have you go to the handouts section of your control panel. You see it highlighted there in red. I have put a handout called Formative Assessment Strategies, and I want you to download that now. I like to do my handouts during webinars as PDFs because they're easier to download, and they might also be easier for you to use in a variety of different ways. And I will have this handout posted as part of our webinar materials afterwards. So go ahead and download the Formative Assessment Strategies handout, and when you've got it downloaded, go ahead and raise your hand electronically so that I know you're ready to move on. All right, it looks like a number of you are finding it in the handouts section of the control panel. If you haven't found it yet, just click on where it says handouts on your control panel, and it should open up and show you that PDF document called Formative Assessment Strategies. Then go ahead and raise your hand electronically once you have that. All right. It looks like almost everybody has it. Great. If not, you can always put a question in the questions box. But we're going to go ahead and look at this today and do an activity with it. Here's a bigger shot of our handout. Notice that there are 12 different formative assessment strategies or learning activities or checks for understanding that teachers can do in the classroom. What I want you to do is read those 12 formative assessment strategies and make a note as you read each one about the ones you've used, either as is, as they're presented here, or maybe modified for a class. You may do it slightly differently. You may have a different name for it or something like that. Or note the ones you could use, either as is or modified in some way before the end of this semester or school year. So I'm going to give you some time just to read that. I want you to read through each one. Please take a note, make notes any way you would like, write directly on that if you want, if you've printed it out or something like that, or highlight it. But just go ahead and read that, and then I'll come back and we'll do an activity with it. All right. If you've had a chance to read through the 12 formative assessment strategies, go ahead and raise your hand electronically so that I know that. Okay, looks like almost everyone has. Thank you for doing that. So let's go ahead and talk about these because I'm sure some were familiar. You may have called them something else, like I said, or you may, of course, have the name of this in the target language that you teach in. That's always important and a good way to help students get used to hearing the language. So let's jump in with our activity. There's two parts to this activity. There's quizzes and then there's an opportunity to share out. So we're going to start with the top row, the first 4 activities on that top row. Which of these strategies have you used or could you use in your classroom, either as they are or modified a bit to fit what you do? And I'm going to go ahead and run that question. And again, you can check all that apply here. So of those 4, which of them have you used or could you use in your classroom? Go ahead and make a note of that. Again, you can click as many as you want. Just touch your screen for the answer that you want to give. All right, let's go ahead and finish up our voting here. Looks like we've got well over half, so go ahead and finish up and respond to this so we have your answers. I'll give it another 5 seconds. Great, thank you for sharing that. And I'll share with you what the answers were. It looks like almost everyone has used exit tickets before. That's not a big surprise. Exit tickets have been around quite a long time, and I know when I've been able to observe classes and things, I have seen exit tickets happening. They're also an easy thing for your students and something you can sort of train your students, if you will, to use. It helps them sum up their learning for the day, depending on what kinds of things you ask them for their exit ticket. An equally popular one was the admit slip, which is the opposite of the exit ticket, doing a check with them, a check for understanding at the beginning of the class before you start rather than at the end like with the exit ticket. And it also looks like we have some people who've done the buddy buzz. The buddy buzz goes by a lot of different names, including think, pair, share, by the way, but I like the term buddy buzz a little bit better. And then people have even done the clock partners and know about that. So that's great. Thank you for sharing. So let's go to the second part of the activity for this. Now let's talk about using these formative assessment strategies in the classroom. I'd like you to share out either by raising your hand to be unmuted and discussing your answers to these questions or typing your answers to these questions in the question box. I'd like you to share which one of these 4 strategies you've used, modified, or could use in your classroom, the theme of the unit or lesson involved in using that formative assessment strategy, the students you're working with, what age and the language they were learning, a description of the activity where you used that formative assessment strategy, and also what you learned as a teacher that helped you adjust your instruction and or your students' language learning based on using that formative assessment strategy. So I'll take a moment. What I'm going to do is make sure, first of all, that we're starting with all hands down. So if you'd like to share out verbally and be unmuted, you can raise your hand to share out. If you'd just like to share but put in the questions box so that I can read it out loud to everyone, you can do that too. It's your choice. All right, I see that Cynthia has raised her hand, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute her. Cynthia, you should be able to share with us. Once I've unmuted you, by the way, you will have control of your own audio, and so you should have a little microphone button, obviously, on your control panel. When you're self-muted, it's orange with a little white microphone icon, and then when you click on it, it should turn to green, and that means green is good to go. We can hear you. Go ahead.
That was not intentional. I'm sorry. So I'm just going to exit myself out of that. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Sometimes that happens too. I do like to let people use the hand raise to give a shout out when they want for things. But if that wasn't the intention, no worries.
Sorry.
All right. How about others? Go ahead and think about, you want to raise your hand to share out verbally, or just type in the questions box the answers to your questions here. All right, I see Maria has shared that she's used the Buddy Buzz, and what she shared was that she's used it in order to discuss in partners or small groups the news of the day in the United States and around the world. So that's a way to get her students involved in current events. Maybe a way to connect to other disciplines like social studies or other things. May be a good way to get them talking using their interpersonal skills as well. Amy said that she's looking forward to using the admit slip tomorrow in her high school Spanish 1 class. She said they watched a 15-minute history video about the Moors in Spain and the contributions of Arabic to Spanish. And so she's going to use that exit or the admit slip tomorrow to get her students thinking about that again. Jennifer says that she has used the clock partners, but instead she made it Cantires partners, where they say find a Guatemala partner, a country's partner. And so you find a Guatemala partner or whatever country you have on your sheet, and then she uses it for all lessons, all units, anytime she needs students to partner up, and they don't mind it being random. So that's kind of a nice way to incorporate, instead of a clock, something that the students need to learn, and which in this case is a map. So she's having them identify different countries, and then they sign up as partners in those different countries. Very nice. Amelia shared that she uses an exit ticket because it gives her immediate feedback and helps her know what she needs to reinforce. And that's an important point, because there's where we're getting that idea of the information you're getting from formative assessment helps you adjust your own instruction in the classroom, which can help your students and also help you be a much better teacher to the students in your classroom. Nancy says she's used the exit ticket, but it's been several years since she's taught in a classroom situation, so she's stepped into a different role. She used to have students answer a variety of questions based on what they had been studying. It's always good to gather that information right as your students are exiting. Lorraine says she's used exit tickets as well to assess the learning of vocabulary. So for example, in French 1, they might be studying the calendar, the days of the week, the months, the day, weather expressions, that kind of thing. And so she uses the exit ticket to assess where they are with their learning of that vocabulary. Magda says she's used the exit ticket to answer simple questions that they've practiced in class, so a little bit of practice as they're leaving the classroom. Cynthia says she's used an exit ticket for all kinds of lessons, high school level. For instance, she uses an image and has students write sentences using a key concept of vocabulary based on that image, and that helps her know where students need support in their learning. All right, great. Thank you for sharing that out. It seems like we're better putting things in the question box, although I do see a couple of folks. It looks like Emily's got her hand raised. Emily, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can share out loud.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay, so for my exit tickets, I use a Google form, and I saw this in the Facebook group, the French Teachers in the US, and so I've altered this Google form that a gentleman created, and so it has the performance assessment chart as an image, and to where students can kind of say, like, did I come to class prepared? What was I able to achieve in the language? Like, so they're marking themselves kind of, and it's just between me and them digitally, so they're not turning in a piece of paper. Their partner can't like look at it. And so we do that several different points throughout the semester, is like a checkup to kind of see what they're doing on their own time, plus what they're doing in my class and like their behavior in the classroom.
Great. And it sounds like you're getting a lot of information and feedback about their learning as you do that. It's also a good time to point out what she shared, in that, she got this idea from a professional development article or resource that she already knows about, but was able to adapt it for her own use and really get a lot out of it. She's also pointed out that formative assessment can be something done in the classroom with other students involved, or it can be a very individual thing, depending on how you do it and what which type of formative assessment strategy you choose to use. All right. I'm going to take a quick look. We've got several people offering what they do with formative assessment in types of formative assessment that we're going to get to in a minute. But I do have Elsie, who says she's used admit slips with a different name with 7th graders in Spanish Level 1 with the topic of describing family members. She asks as they enter to write about what a family member loves to do. Then they share as a round robin and that helps her see how much the students have learned from the day before and how much they've retained. Great. That's an admit slip. Katerina also says she asks students to text her during the week in the target language to answer questions related to what they are learning. So she uses texting as the course is taught online. So that's kind of, I don't know what we'd call that. It's not exactly an admit slip or an exit ticket. Maybe it's a texting ticket that you're getting or something like that. And that is a good way you're getting feedback from students and making sure that you understand what questions they have and that you're able to respond to those. And we do have a request. The Google form that was just described, they're asking you if you can share a link to that Google form so that we can share it with this. And I would definitely encourage you to do that. Anytime we have a resource like that we want to share, just like with the handouts and other resources we're going to talk about today, I always make those available with the archive of this webinar broadcast. And so if you're free to share that Google form or where you got it, that'd be great. If you can share it today, that'd be wonderful. If not, you can always email me with the information later if it takes you a while to dig up the resource. That's great too. All right, and by the way, Emily said sure she would be happy to share that Google form. She's going to go look for it. All right, great. Well, let's move on then. We were just talking about 4 of these formative assessment strategies out of 12. Let's go forward. I bet you can guess what we're going to do next, which is look at the next 4 on that middle row: the inside-outside circle, the matrix, the numbered heads, and the round table. Once again, I'll go ahead and run a poll question asking you which of these strategies you've used or could use in your classroom. And we'll do what we did before, which is share out here in a minute. But let's start with our poll question. Oh, I apologize. I accidentally closed the poll before I was ready to. I was going to give a bit more time, but it looks like a majority have already voted. So we'll go ahead. Let me share with you what the results were. So for these 4 assessment strategies, we have over half the folks who've used numbered heads or some version of numbered heads. We also have almost half who've used inside-outside circle. And inside-outside circle can be a really good way to work on interpersonal skills, of course, in a language learning classroom, but you can work on a number of other things too. We also had a lot of people who've used round table and a few who've used matrix. So let's hear about that, as you might expect. Our next slide is to ask you again to share out about these 4. So just for these 4, inside, outside circle, matrix, numbered heads, and round table, go ahead and share how you've used that. And once again, if you want to raise your hand to share out, I will be looking for raised hands. You can always enter in the questions box too, or just raise your hand. I don't see any hands raised at the moment. So if you did raise your hand to share on this one and the system somehow took it down, please go ahead and raise again. And again, I'm also looking for ones in the questions box. All right. It looks like Amy is sharing that she's used inside outside circle. She said not a circle, but 2 lines actually, so a different shape to use, but so inside outside lines. And then partners meet at the front of the room, and they give a mini conversation using the vocabulary that they're currently studying, and then they go to the end of the line and switch roles. So that's a nice way to keep students moving and also to try different perspectives on the different roles within the conversation. Lorraine says she's used Roundtable to assess concepts such as the passé composé in French. Students were given infinitives, and they would have to write past participles and then the helping verb either être or avoir. And for those of you who are not French teachers, please know that as you're constructing a sentence in the passé composé or the past tense in French, there's different helping verbs we use, être or avoir, to be or to have, that students have to know how to use correctly in order to be understood. So this is a bit of a drill down on grammar on this, but certainly with formative assessment, you want to make sure that students know all the different pieces so that they can communicate effectively with the language that they have. All right. Jennifer says she's also used inside outside to ask survey questions, like how many siblings do you have, or things like that in the target language. So again, using it for questioning and using the target language. They have to take the data they get from the survey questions and then summarize it in the target language. And she does this with her middle school students. All right. So that's all I see right now. I'm looking at our time too. I want us to be cautious with that. So let's go ahead and move on to the last part of this activity, which, as you might guess, is the bottom row, the seed strategy, the symbolic indicators, the thumbs up, down, and the right around. So which of these strategies have you used or could you use in your classroom? And I'll go ahead and run that question, and you can respond. Again, you can choose more than one. All right, go ahead and finish sharing on this poll. What have you used or could you use in your classroom of these 4 formative assessment strategies? All right, looks like we're done voting. Go ahead and close the poll and then share our results. All right, looks like we have people who've used, like quite a few people who've used thumbs up, thumbs down. Over half have used the right around strategy. About a third have used the seed strategy, and almost 20% have used symbolic indicators. So let's hear from folks. How have you used those? What's worked in your classroom? In our share out for these 4 strategies. All right. We do have one more person who talked about inside-outside circle from the time before, and she says she's used that to have students ask names and how to spell the name in the target language after saying the name, and she uses that with her 5th and 6th graders who are taking Spanish. All right. Maria has shared that she uses the seed strategy, although she didn't know it was named that way. And this is a good point. Sometimes you'll come across these formative assessment strategies that someone's using, maybe a mentor teacher you know, or someone sharing something during a conference or meeting. They may have a different name for it, but it boils down to the same thing. So Maria said she has students go to the board, write and discuss the sentence with student input and finally the teacher's suggestions and input, and then they usually draw for individuals. I also have Hong saying she used SEED in her online classes. And this is a good time to point out that all of these formative assessment strategies can be adapted in different ways depending on the technology you have and the environment you're teaching in. So there's a lot of different ways you could adjust and adapt these for use in the classroom you have, whether that's an online classroom, a face-to-face classroom, or some sort of blended classroom. Magda says she used thumbs up and down on a regular basis, and that's just to touch base with students on their level of comprehension or confidence in their skill level with something that they're working on in class. All right. Cynthia also says that she's used SEED. She says she likes to use it when they work on reflexive verbs because students write about their routines, they peer review their sentences, and then have her as the teacher review them. She returns them, and then students rewrite their sentences with drawings to illustrate. That's a really good way to get students thinking about their routine and those reflexive verbs. And again, for those who don't know French or teach a different language that doesn't have reflexive verbs. Reflexive verbs are those verbs that you do for yourself. So they're verbs like, waking up in the morning, getting dressed, and getting ready. So those are all the kinds of reflexive verbs that often we're teaching in French. All right. Amy says that she's used Write Around. She said she used it as a competition to practice the days, months, and numbers. And when she did it, the students who got the sentences could correct the previous answer, but only the one previous answer. So they really had to be watching for each other and helping each other out. And she had them do it in teams. So the team that finished first with the most correct answers won. And that's a really good way to get students involved and working together, as you can see. Lorraine also said she's used Write Around to help assess students' ability to produce basic presentational conversations. So one student starts with bonjour, je m'appelle Michelle, for example, or hello, my name is Michelle, and the next adds a statement that logically follows. So they have to be listening to each other or writing with each other and making sure they're paying good attention. And you might be able to do that in a presentational way with writing if you're doing something like a skit or something like that you're having them write out. All right. Elsie shares that she could use Write Around for her students learning to describe family members and non-family members. The prompt could be a picture of a family and then have students write a descriptive sentence about the hair, the eyes, the moods, the likes or dislikes, and the things that whatever the picture indicates that students might be able to draw from that. It's a good idea to use a visual like that at the start. Katerina says she also likes the Write Around strategy. She might be able to use it as a discussion forum format in an online class. So each next student has to add to what is already written by a previous student. So maybe they could describe a painting, which would be a nice way to bring in things like other disciplines, particularly here in the case of visual arts with a painting. And then students could then use that to describe and help each other learn to think about how they might write about the painting. She also noticed that these are all great strategies to try, and I agree. These are just 12 formative assessment strategies. As you can see, they're ones that I have pulled from some of our LinguaFolio modules, as well as work shared by Margarita Calderon and her associates. So we've had a lot of folks who've come to North Carolina and worked on formative assessment and shared resources with us, but I'm sure you know a lot of these too. So these are just 12 of our strategies, formative assessment strategies, that we work with on a regular basis. All right, that brings us to the end of our activity. I'm going to look for any additional questions. I will say that the Google form we talked about earlier that Emily shared, she shared with me information about that, so I will be posting that with our materials for this webinar, so you'll have access to that. All right, I don't see any further questions. So thank you for doing that formative assessment activity with me. Please keep that handout and think about how you can use that or how you might want to add to it. And I would love to hear other formative assessment strategies that you use in your classroom that really work well. It's always helpful to share teacher to teacher. All right, so let's go on to the next part of our webinar, and that's focusing in on a formative assessment tool that you may have heard about, LinguaFolio. And of course, the focus of LinguaFolio, when we think about formative assessment, is can-do learning and having can-do statements that students use and that you can use in the classroom to formatively assess what they're learning and how to adjust your instruction. So let's start with, what is LinguaFolio, in case someone doesn't know. LinguaFolio is a proficiency-based, student-centered formative assessment tool, just like it says there on the slide. The goal of LinguaFolio is threefold. First is to empower learners so that they manage their own language learning. It's also to provide a place for learners to collect evidence showing their growth, because in the word LinguaFolio, you hear folio, which is like a portfolio, and part of this is a portfolio where students collect the evidence of their learning. LinguaFolio also facilitates language learning in and outside the classroom, so it doesn't matter where your students are getting their language input and their learning, they can combine it all together. LinguaFolio really guides learners to reflect on their own learning process and to take responsibility for their own learning. They also begin to take ownership of their learning and play an active part in constantly assessing and evaluating themselves. So they can kind of look at which language domain do they need to improve, what vocabulary do they need to learn better. And as they progress in their language learning, LinguaFolio, as I said, is a language portfolio that learners can keep throughout their educational and professional careers to document their language competencies in all languages, and that includes things like heritage languages or home languages, as well as English for speakers of other languages. And so LinguaFolio applies to all languages in general. You can see there are several quotes at the bottom of these slides, and these are slides that are pulled from some of our LinguaFolio training that we've done. And LinguaFolio really is a new way of thinking about teaching and learning. Just like formative assessment always helps us think about our teaching and learning in the classroom, LinguaFolio is a way to kind of shift to sharing that responsibility for language learning with learners and making sure that everyone is moving forward in their language learning. Now, just a little bit of history. LinguaFolio was developed by the members of the National Council of State Supervisors for Languages, or with the acronym NCSSFL, NCSSFL, and it's based on the European Language Portfolio, or ELP, and the NCSSFL Actful Can-Do statements. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail here in a bit. The can-do statements are organized according to the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, or ACTFL, proficiency levels and sublevels. Of course, those are the proficiency levels we use in our state standards for language learning here in North Carolina. And that's an important point because LinguaFolio is aligned to the North Carolina Standard Course of Study, or SCOS, and it supports our student outcomes for proficiency in both the English Language Development Standards for English as a Second Language programs, as well as the World Language Essential Standards for all languages, including classical language programs where languages like Latin and Ancient Greek are taught, dual and heritage language programs where you have dual language immersion programs, as well as heritage language, which used to be called native speaker programs. And then any modern language program, whether it's an alphabetic language, a logographic language like Chinese or Japanese, or a visual language like American Sign Language. So LinguaFolio, as it says at the bottom, is a tool for those who are learning or have learned a language at school or outside of school to record and reflect on their language learning and cultural experiences. LinguaFolio does have three main components. So when you go to look at LinguaFolio as a document, it has these three things. First of all, it has a biography. And the biography is just what you would think it would be. It's a record of students' personal language learning history that helps them learn to set goals and reflect on their language learning and intercultural experiences. We're going to talk a lot about can-do learning here in the next few slides, and the can-do statements that go with LinguaFolio are kept in this biography because those can-do statements are a record of the student's personal language learning across the different communication modes and culture, or across the standards within our curriculum here in North Carolina. LinguaFolio also has a dossier, and the dossier is just a collection of work samples that are chosen by the learner to show or document their language learning process with the skills in each mode of communication and in culture. The dossier can be used to demonstrate the individual's language ability to others. So that might be their teacher, because obviously as a teacher, if you were using LinguaFolio, you would see what evidences a student chose to include in their dossier in their LinguaFolio. It might be something that they can share with their parents, or you as their teacher could share with their parents as well during conferences or information. And then because the LinguaFolio belongs to the student, this is something they can choose to share with their peers as well as potential employers. And we do have anecdotal stories of students having LinguaFolio as they were in high school and even into college, and then taking that on to show potential employers or even to the college or university campus so that they could show for placement purposes where they were with their language learning. Finally, the third part of LinguaFolio is the passport. And the passport is just sort of a summary, a snapshot of experiences and competencies in different languages. So this is where things like in the biography with the can-do statements are summed up. It's updated frequently, and it also records things like formal qualifications, like a degree or something you would get, diplomas, or even diploma endorsements like North Carolina's Global Languages Endorsement, our seal of biliteracy. It might have some self-assessments or even summative test scores. If students have taken something like the AP World Language Exam in the languages that they're learning, it would record that information there because that's a quick snapshot of where they are with their language learning. So those are the three components. One thing to note is that LinguaFolio, because it comes to us nationally from Necessful, is being updated. And so some of the terms, biography, dossier, and passport, may ultimately be updated, or you may have seen different versions of them. So, you know, a dossier could have been just the folio piece of it, or the passport sometimes is called a profile. It just depends. But the important thing is that LinguaFolio has those three components and they have a certain function. Now, let's talk a little bit about these necessful, actful, can-do statements in LinguaFolio. LinguaFolio, from its start, has always had a series of can-do statements. They used to be presented as checklists, and they would have students go down and really look at, you know, what they could do in the language, and then show evidence for each statement within each communication mode. The latest update for the necessful, actful, can-do statements for use in LinguaFolio came in October of 2017. So they're just over a year and a half old. There were also updates in previous years, like in 2013 and 2010. And of course, the can-do statements, based on their name, are a collaboration between Necessful, that originally brought us LinguaFolio, but also Actful, our national organization, and the organization that brings us our proficiency scale. One thing to note in the 2017 update is that for the first time, we had can-do statements for intercultural competence. So specifically for culture when we think about our own standards in language learning. That was brand new for 2017 to be released officially nationally. We had some states developing can-do statements for culture, but that information was brought together in the revision that was published in 2017. All right, we're just going to take a quick look at our necessful, actful, can-do statements because I'm noticing our time and I know we've got a few things to get through and share with you here. This is what the overall necessful, actful, can-do statements look like. And what you see here are proficiency benchmarks, obviously for interpretive communication, which is our second essential standard in North Carolina. Interpretive communication is reading, listening, and viewing. Also interpersonal communication. And then presentational communication, which is writing and formal speaking. At the bottom, you see the intercultural communication components, and those are investigate and interact. One thing to note about these slides is I often have links set up, so I've just gone out by clicking on that slide to the actual Actful site where the necessful, actful, can-do statements are posted. You see that these are the proficiency benchmarks, so they're the overall statements that you find in LinguaFolio. As we progress on, you can see that then those can-do statements overall, those proficiency benchmarks, are broken down a bit by mode of communication first, and then a repeat of the proficiency benchmark, and then within 3 language functions for each communication mode. Those are presented as questions. And then you see you have performance indicators, which are more specific can-do or I can statements that students would be working with. This is also something you can use as a teacher, obviously, to shape your instruction. And notice how things are color-coded. Not a big surprise. We like to do that in education. But notice that novice level proficiency benchmarks and then performance indicators are in blue. Intermediate level is in green for the proficiency benchmarks and then a further breakdown in performance educators. And advanced is in orange for those proficiency benchmarks and performance indicators. There are also superior and distinguished level can-do statements. In our state standards, however, we go from novice low to advanced mid because it was thought that based on the research we had and the feedback at the time we wrote the standards, advanced mid was as far up as we would have students expecting to go in their language proficiency, even in a well-articulated K-12 program. Of course, we might have students exceed those expectations, but that's how we've structured our standards. So we have can-do statements for all of the levels, plus some that we have in our state standards. And then you notice that part of the necessitable actual can-do statements is a further breakdown, starting again with that proficiency benchmark, and we're looking at a novice example here. And again, repeating those language functions, the performance indicators, and then as a further breakdown from those, we also have examples. And these are the more detailed I can statements that might match very well with things that you're doing in the units in your classroom. Notice that they're broken down for each communication mode by those proficiency benchmarks. And so there's very careful articulation throughout. Also notice that the I can statements are just examples. They're literally labeled examples, but also there's the first one always says I can ... and that's where you can customize with your specific content. So this is a tool that you use to work towards proficiency in your classroom and within LinguaFolio. Now, LinguaFolio, as I said, is available for the whole U.S. as well as North Carolina. One of the interesting things about LinguaFolio is that it was designed by people in Necessful. So people in Necessful are people in positions like I have. I'm your world languages consultant at the Department of Public Instruction. And so state level individuals, world language educators, worked on these. And the commitment was to make sure that these were always available as a free resource to teachers and programs. To do that, we created LinguaFolio through Necessful, and we have it available on the Necessful website so that anyone can go and get the LinguaFolio materials that they need. And that includes the things you see here, the overall information about LinguaFolio that we shared on the first few slides about it, as well as a fact sheet. There's information about LinguaFolio research and training, and there's also the Necessful actual can-do statements that you can download. Now, one thing that's nice that I try to do for us in North Carolina every year is to make sure that we have the most updated LinguaFolio materials, not only available on the national website like you see here, but also available on our state world language website. Most of you are aware, I think, that we have switched from using Wikispaces, because they went out of business, to having Google Sites at the state level. And so I'm in the process of moving all of our LinguaFolio materials over so that we have them on our world language website here in the state, and you can access them there. You don't have to go to the national website, although you're certainly welcome to go there if you would like to see them posted there as well. And this is to show you where, in fact, you can find them on our website. We have a whole LinguaFolio for North Carolina section. You can see this is just a screenshot of the landing page. LinguaFolio is available under our standards because it's a standards aligned or proficiency-based tool that we can use with our standards directly. And it's also available in resources on its own tab. I have created a bit.ly link as well to make it easier for us to find those materials that we want to work with. Here's a shot of the actual LinguaFolio page starting that section. Notice it outlines it first as formative assessment for North Carolina and talks about what LinguaFolio does, kind of what we went over. One important thing to note is that on that page that you see there, circled in red is where classroom materials will be located. And notice that again, I'm trying to move everything over so that we have it on our own website and in different formats so we can have LinguaFolio documents, including the can-do statements, as either Word documents or PDF documents if we want to have them that way. And we also have a LinguaFolio Online or LFO for North Carolina. It's been customized in the sense, the LFO for NC, so that we have access to it for free. And what that basically means is we have a contract with the university who puts LinguaFolio online and makes LFO so that we have a certain number of LFO accounts that we can access. So we have the regular LFO that everyone else has in every other state, but we have our own special login, and that's what you see here on our LFO for NC page that we can access. As you note, we are working with the Title VI Language Resource Center at the University of Oregon, and they have created LFO for NC for us, which replaces eLinguaFolio, which some of you may have used as the online version earlier in your work with students. But we are entirely switched over to LFO for NC now. So let's stop there for a moment, and I want to know, what is your experience with LinguaFolio? Do you just know a little bit about LinguaFolio? Maybe even learned a little bit today, or maybe you knew some before? Have you used LinguaFolio in your classroom before? Have you had training on LinguaFolio? Have you been or are you involved in the LFO for NC pilot? Or maybe there's something else you know with your experience with LinguaFolio. So once again, I'll go ahead and launch that poll question, and you can share with me what your experience is with LinguaFolio. All right, go ahead and finish up our poll. We'll take about 10 more seconds. All right, thank you for sharing that. Let's go ahead and take a look and see what everybody said. All right, the majority of you, 2/3, said you know a little bit about LinguaFolio. That's good. It's a good start. 38% said you've used LinguaFolio in your classroom before. 19% said you've had some training on LinguaFolio. 14% said you've been involved or are involved in the current LFO for NC pilot. And then I had one person who didn't check other, but indicated they had used LinguaFolio last year. Looks like LFO for NC last year, but her students couldn't log in. And that's important to know, because as we switch over to LFO for NC totally for our online version, we want to make sure we solve all of our login problems and have access to the tool as we need it. Notice that our LFO for NC page has a place to go to for technical issues. The LFO support team is wonderful at the University of Oregon, and I'm sure they can solve any problems that we have. But the LFO for NC pilot is ongoing, as it says there. We started in spring of 2018 with a limited pilot, and we've expanded it this year, and we're continuing to expand it going into this next school year, 2019-2020, with involving teachers and receiving free accounts for LFO for themselves and their students, and being able to use it through implementation practices. So that's ongoing. If it's something you're interested in, by the way, please let me know. We are, as I said, sort of expanding things as we go, and we do have a certain number of accounts with the states, meaning that we can access those for free. All right. Thank you for answering that poll again. All right, so let's finish up with a few things. I know we're right at 5 o'clock. I certainly understand if you have to go, but if you can hang on a few more minutes, I do have some resources to share with you. Otherwise, you can check back later and get them. LinguaFolio training is available 24/7. We have 7 online training modules. Those were actually first developed in North Carolina, so there are a number of North Carolina world language educators, both administrators and teachers, in those videos that go with the online training modules. And sometimes we even have folks on the line during these broadcasts who were part of those videos or had students in them. There are also moved now to the Necessful website, and you can see their reference there. They're part of the training materials available on the national website, but also they have been incorporated into a LinguaFolio training Canvas course specifically for North Carolina. And that's one of the things that's relatively new, and that if you're interested in learning more about LinguaFolio, you can become involved in and take that online course and earn contact hours towards the CEU as you learn about LinguaFolio. Also, there's LinguaFolio training done face-to-face and in blended ways. There have been past offerings of LinguaFolio training at conferences, so those of you who said you'd been involved in some LinguaFolio training may in fact have gone to a workshop at FLANC, the Foreign Language Association North Carolina Conference, or the Carolina TESOL Conference. TESOL is the Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages, so the state organization for our ESL teachers. There's also been flank pre-conference webinars using the 1-hour versions of LinguaFolio training that are adapted for teachers or administrators, and those are drawn from Module 1 of the LinguaFolio online training modules. Note that all 7 online training modules are involved in the Canvas course for LinguaFolio training, and we've also used those materials from the modules in local workshops and trainings. So you may have received training on LinguaFolio in that manner too. If you're curious about the Introduction to LinguaFolio Canvas course, this is kind of what it looks like. This is the home page. As you can see, it defines what LinguaFolio is as a formative assessment tool. And notice that there are 8 modules. So those 7 that I told you about are all there. And then we have an 8th module within our training for North Carolina that talks about connecting LinguaFolio to the North Carolina Educator Evaluation System, or NESYS, that teachers are evaluated on by their principals or whoever their supervisor is. We also have some additional LinguaFolio training and resources that if you are familiar with the wiki space, you're probably looking for, and those are going to be posted soon on our new World Languages website. We have teacher videos that were captured in 2012 at what we call a LinguaFolio carousel, which is sort of a showcase of people using LinguaFolio. In fact, we have a couple of teachers who were part of that showcase on the line today. They are from 8 different perspectives, showing LinguaFolio in different types of classrooms. So there's 3 ESL videos showing an elementary, a middle school, and a high school ESL classroom and students using LinguaFolio. There are 4 world language versions from middle and high school. There's a face-to-face French class, a face-to-face Spanish class, and an online Russian class using LinguaFolio. And then there's also a dual language immersion program that uses LinguaFolio and was featured in those teacher videos that were part of the 2012 work. In addition, we've provided several other resources that, again, are going to be available on the LinguaFolio section of our World Languages website soon. There's an ESL Professional Learning Community, or PLC, guide that's been developed, and that was right out of the 7 online modules, and it was a way to make that more user-friendly to do the modules, let's say, within a PLC and do them as a group, as opposed to doing the modules individually. There's also LinguaFolio webinar series archives that we can share. You can see they've come from past school years. In 2016-17, we did Introduction to LinguaFolio for administrators and several other pieces that were sort of repackaged, if you will, for different audiences from the LinguaFolio modules. In 2017-18, there are new necessitable, actual, can-do statements that come out, so we spent those broadcasts focusing on exploring those new statements and how they were set up and structured, as well as how they would work within LinguaFolio. So those are a number of resources that we're going to be reposting for you to explore. And then finally, there's several articles from the Language Educator that I wanted to share with you today, because these will help you whether you look into LinguaFolio or just want to learn more about can-do statements and using those within your classroom as formative assessment tools. The Language Educator is ACTFL's practitioner publication. There's a lot of good things there, and one of the things that's really nice about this is that every time the Language Educator is published, and it's published 4 to 6 times a year, the ACTFL always posts not only the entire Language Educator available for the ACTFL members to access, but in fact posts a free sample article from each edition so that people can learn more about whatever the topic is in language education they're studying. So in August and September of 2017, there was an article specifically on using the newly revised can-do statements to make learning transparent and to really look at some scenarios where can-do learning and formative assessment obviously was going on. So I've linked here that PDF of that 7-page article, but I've also got links to the ACTFL website where you can download it yourself. You just have to know that it was in August and September of 2017. In addition, later on in January and February of 2018, there was another article in the Language Educator that looked at moving from culture to intercultural communication. Because as I said, in the 2017 version of the successful ACTFL can-do statements, that was the first time we had intercultural statements in addition to the communication mode statements. So this looked at framing that cultural landscape of your classroom and sort of teaching, starting with culture and using those can-do statements. Once again, that's one of the sample articles available for free from ACTFL, so anyone can access it. And that brings us to any questions you have about LinguaFolio. So I'm going to pause here and take a look at our question box. All right. Seeing no particular questions, let's go ahead and finish out for today. I just wanted to end with a few reminders and resources that might be helpful to you as world language educators. First and foremost, we have this webinar series every year. In 2018-19, you can see we had 3 different versions. We had this series, which is Measuring World Language Proficiency. Notice today was our last day of that, so that series is done for the year. We also had the DPI World Language Quarterly Updates series. That one also is finished out for this year. And then the last broadcast we have will be next Wednesday on May 15th, and it'll be an Essential Standards K-12 Program Showcase webinar looking at modern language programs. So you're welcome at any of those. They're always on Wednesdays. I call them our World Language Wednesdays, so they're easy to remember. And they're always from 4 to 5 p.m. or after school once everyone's done with their responsibilities with students. Just a reminder, I do post all of the things from our webinar series, including a recording of the broadcast, the presentation slides, any handouts and links that we share so that you can get that information. Our 2 more recent ones were the other Measure World Language Proficiency webinar on Summative Assessment, as well as the World Language Quarterly Update webinar. Both of those were on dates in April, so not too long ago. And then, of course, we also have some PD coming up through our state organization of FLANK. FLANK has ShareFests in May. These are 3-hour or half-day informal sessions, unconference sessions. They have them all over the state on Saturdays. Their first one was last Saturday. That was the Eastern Region ShareFest in Cary. And coming up on this Saturday, there are 2. There's a Southern Region ShareFest in St. Paul's, North Carolina, and a Western Region ShareFest in Hendersonville, North Carolina. The following Saturday, May 18th, there'll be a Dual Language Immersion or DLI ShareFest in Charlotte and a Northern Region ShareFest in Winston-Salem. FLANK is organized with regional representatives from across the state from 4 different regions, and then they're also offering a ShareFest for specifically Dual Language Immersion educators this year. Additional details about that are on the FLANK ShareFest webpage. You can get that information there if you're interested in going to those. Those, by the way, are free opportunities to get together with other language educators and hear what they're doing in the classroom. They are in an unconference format, so very free-flowing, and they do give you 3 contact hours towards licensure renewal. In addition, the FLANK Annual Fall Conference is coming up in October, FLANK 19, with the theme of What's Your Piece of the Puzzle? Proposals have been accepted for 3-hour workshops, 50-minute sessions, research roundtables, and even pre-conference webinars. Registration is now open on the FLANK website that you see there. Finally, I'd like to share with you to always be sure you're signed up to DPI listservs for world languages. There are 4 of them. There's one for DLI educators, one for NC LinguaFolio itself, one for World Language Instructors K-20, and a very general one about world language education news. There are also other DPI listservs you may be interested in, such as those for charter schools, for global education, for the legislative updates, for teachers of English learners, and so on. So you can click on those links there and in the notes to get to that information and sign up for other listservs if you would like. That concludes our webinar today. I thank you for joining me. I hope you've gotten some information you can use in your classroom or share with others. I am Anne-Marie Gunter, your World Languages Consultant. You can contact me via phone or email. Notice I do have a new phone number on there. We also have our NCDPI World Languages Facebook page, and I would encourage you to like that because I put out a lot of classroom resources on that. And of course, we have our NCDPI World Languages website. And I have our regular web address as well as our bit.ly link, so bit.ly/NCDPIWL for World Languages. And the circles show you where, in fact, we post the webinar materials and have the webinar series information for you to go back and take a look at these materials. I do thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a great evening.